Described as an isolated empire by the historian Frederick Athern, northwestern Colorado has always been remote and sparsely populated. Until the late 19th century, only Ute Indians, mountain men, and later a few outlaws ventured there. In this immense land in 1880, only 146 people were permanent residents. It was deep into the 20th century before more than a few people came to stay. Lack of population meant a lack of development. A long-hoped-for railroad did not reach Craig until 1913. Stagecoaches still linked communities as late as 1916. Main roads were not improved until the 1930s and 40s. Some secondary roads into, for example, the legendary Browns Park area are still unpaved. The physical environment explains much. Beautiful, but stark and unforgiving. Like most arid regions, it gives little and exacts much. For the settlers, it was a constant battle against the lack of moisture and heat of the summer, the bitter cold winters, and the uncertain springs. Nothing was dependable. The people who settled this country from the 1880s to the 1920s were determined and resourceful. They spent their lives working this hard, difficult land. And while stories have been told and written about the cowboys, the ranchers, the miners, the men, very little is known about the experiences of the women. This is their story. Until 1909, when the railroad reached Steamboat Springs, most settlers came to northwestern Colorado in wagons.
When Dad left the farm, and we went into Alamusa, and he went work for a while in the railroad shops. Then he decided that he was going to Oregon. So he assembled a mother and we kids, which my brother then was my youngest brother, a small baby, got us all together in a covered wagon. And we were going to Oregon, and he had some friends named of Smith. There were 2 or 3 more wagons of them and one carriage coming, and we had quite a lot of fun and adventures and stunts that we pulled. And it was, I remember how it rained in a time or two. Mud, oh brother. And 5, 6 of us, and 2 dogs and 2 cats in a covered wagon. It was rather full, but it was, we kids had a ball. It was right around the 4th of July when we left Alamusa, and we arrived in Craig, down here at the old bridge on Bear River on the 7th of August. And there were so many places that there were no road. They just kind of wandered around to find places to go on through. I remember a snow slide that, why there was no road around that snow slide, why we went over it, I'll never know. But Dad, what he called rough locked the hind wheels of the wagon so it wouldn't slide. Made Mother and we children and the dogs and the cats walk down that snow slide to get down it. And that was, Dad was scared spitless, of course, but oh, we had a ball because we could slide on that old icy snow and things like that, and I remember that. The most miserable part of it was when it would rain and we were penned in. The cooking, of course, was done on bonfires outside. And Mother was one of these clean people, and she just couldn't stand all this greasy dirt and stuff, and she was eternally scrubbing the kettles and pans and things to keep them halfway eatable so we could eat the food. And this one night that we were penned in, I remember this rancher coming up to the wagon, and we were trying to eat supper, I know, cold snacks. And he had a great big bundle of fresh vegetables and a gallon bucket of fresh milk that he brought to us, which that's a real fond memory of how nice he was to us.
When the families reached the area they planned to settle, they cleared the land and built shelters. In addition to all the household duties, women often helped their husbands with these tasks. Life was hard at times, but neighbors found time to gather for dinners, dances, and picnics.
And the next morning they loaded our sleds and we headed for Maybelle. So we stayed till March in this little cabin, 2 rooms. And then we moved to our homestead, which was nothing but sagebrush. And you started to work. The first thing you did, you got your axe and you chopped the sagebrush to start in, to put your tent. We lived in a tent from March until January. And it was very cold, I'm telling you. My dad had to sit up many nights and keep the fire going so we wouldn't freeze. And, you know, we didn't have any wood. You know what our wood was? Sagebrush. You were busy clearing the sagebrush to plant a little garden so you'd have something to eat and you'd have some food for your horses. And, of course, we made the dugout, which is an earth house, they call them now. That was our home, the dugout, which was a wonderful thing after living in the tent in the cold.
Well, I realize that a lot of people nowadays, the younger generation, don't know what a dugout is. It's just a little home dug back into a hill. Has a dirt roof, dirt floor, dirt walls, and it usually sticks up out of the ground far enough that you can have a tiny window up at the top. One window in the front, and in that dugout, I think there was one in the back. I lived in another dugout, too. That was Durt's mother's dugout. Her homestead cabin is what it was. But, well, the dirt walls weren't covered there either, but they were hard, and they didn't shale off bad. And the floors were dirt, but to make them hard, we would sprinkle them every day, sweep the trash up, of course, and then sprinkle them. And as we walked on it, that packed it hard. It became hard as clay or cement almost. In this little dugout, we had a big cook range, wood coal range that belonged to Durt's mother, and it was in one corner. And then we had a cupboard made of orange crates, and then our little table was in the next corner, I think, toward that other end, and the bed over across from it in that corner. And we had to fix some way to hang clothes, just a rod fixed up some way with a curtain around it for our closet. And behind the door was a big barrel that in the winter, we'd gather snow, clean snow, and put in that.
We dug our well, him and I. And then we got about 12 feet down, we got into solid gravel. It had to be blown up. So I'd go down there on a ladder, help him drill a hole, and he'd put the dynamite in, and then put a long fuse on it. And I'd come back up the ladder, and we had a rope on the ladder, so that when he jumped out, I could already pull the ladder. And then we'd run. Boy, rocks would just be blown up everywhere. Well, then he'd go back down in and load it into that bucket, and I pulled it out. And I had to drag it a ways to dump it. But it was just an everyday job to me.
We raised the sheep, the lambs at Zenobia, in that country. And then in the fall, we moved to Sandwich country, which was, probably 10, 15 miles from home. And we lived in a sheep wagon over there. When Minford was so sick, he had an operation and he couldn't ride a horse. And so I was determined to keep on with the sheep. And I told him if he would take care of Elmora in the wagon, she was about 2 years old. I said, if you'll take care of her, I'll herd the sheep. And so I herded the sheep that winter.
Well, we had as nice a place as there was to live, but no conveniences of any kind. We had coal oil lights. We had to carry our water in and carry it out and heat it on a cook stove. And you had to take care of the milk. You couldn't buy milk. You had to have cows, and you had to either separate your milk or strain it up in pans and make your own butter. And I made my own soap. I learned to do all of that. I had haymen to cook for because it was summer and you went right into haying, and you get up early in the morning and cook breakfast and wash the dishes and take care of the milk and figure out what you're going to have for dinner, because you had dinner at noon, and you had a big breakfast always. You'd have, you hardly ever had pancakes. We usually had biscuits. I'd like to have a nickel for all the biscuits I'd made. And you had bacon and eggs, and you had your own bacon. You cured your own meat in the spring, you know. Your pigs, you butchered so many, and you had your bacon and your ham. And eggs, you had chickens, so you had your eggs. Or if you could possibly sneak a deer and keep it a secret, you could have fresh meat and gravy, you know, like that for breakfast. Well, then you had your big meal at noon, and that was always meat and potatoes and a dessert. Usually you'd wash on Monday, and that was a big deal. And at first I had just the washboard, and Joe would help me. In the wintertime, he'd help with the long underwear and the sheets and things. And then finally we got a washing machine, but it was one that you had to turn by hand. It wasn't the power machine. And then you'd had to iron. Everything had to be ironed.
The children's lives were full of work at home and at school. They were needed for the work on the land and in the home as soon as they were 5 or 6 years old. If the first child was female, she often helped her father in the fields and with the stock, as well as helping her mother in the house with the cooking, washing, and caring for the younger children. But some moments were left for play with brothers, sisters, and neighbors.
We all had the things that we had to do. I remember when I must have been in the 7th or 8th grade when the sheep came in here, 1925. And my brother and I got out and gathered bum lambs, as they called them. We put them in a sack and stick their heads out through the hole in the sack and carry them on our horses, you know. Every day when we'd go to those sheep camps, and then if it rained and was bad weather especially, we'd always have lambs. We raised 157 bum lambs one spring, but we had to take responsibility. We learned to milk cows at a very early age and do all the things that had to be done, because my dad had to be gone some and work out to make a living. We weren't that well fixed financially. And we had to help Mother take a hold and do the garden work and take care of the animals and shovel out the ditches and all that sort of thing. It just had to be done, and we all learned to work. I remember I baked my first cake I baked my own birthday cake when I was 7 years old. And from then on after that, I always helped with the cooking. And my dad and I always planted the potatoes, because the boys thought it was funny to throw potatoes or something at Dad while he was driving the team. You know, they had just old walking plows them days, you know, is how we planted potatoes. And that was one of the special things that I did that was outside chores, was to always help my dad plant the potatoes.
Oh, I always had a horse that I rode to school. I'd come to school every day, no matter how cold it was, 40 below zero, and my folks would wrap me up. If I'd have fallen off, I'd have never hit the ground because I had a coat on, and then I had a army coat that my dad had from Troop D, heavy kind of an overcoat I put on top of all of that, and they'd just set me up on my horse. And I'd come to town to a livery stable, and there was an old man down there by the name of Fred Johnson. And he'd have to take me off. I had so many wraps. I was such a little kid.
Winters weren't so bad, except that we always wanted to get outdoors and play, and so often we weren't able to go outdoors and play in the winter. The snow would get so deep. But we made our own playthings. Mom had lots of postcards. We built houses with them, palaces, and then we wrecked them and built more. Also, we didn't really have paper dolls most of the time, but I cut out paper dolls. Dad taught me how, out of catalog paper. And also Wilbur and I together, we built regular farms out of these things, and pasteboard boxes. I wish you could have seen those ranches full of cattle and sheep and what have you. We had fun. We rode horseback, we walked, we climbed hills, we walked fences, we climbed trees, we climbed clear up in the top of box elder trees and sit on the highest branches we thought would bear our weight and whittle. In the summertime, when it was possible, we climbed the hills and we laid in the shade and watched the clouds and made mansions out of the clouds. I remember once Wilbur said the angels were bucking in the sky. We made pictures out of the clouds. One day we climbed to the top of the hill. The first time we'd ever climbed to the real top of the little hill. It wasn't very high. We'd only gone as far as the ledge of rocks before. But this day we were real adventuresome, and so we climbed over to the top of the hill. And it was different from what I'd expected completely. You could just we could see bear's ears up in Wyoming. It was a real summer day, and the smells, I remember the smell of dust and sage, and kind of an animal smell too, and all together, and the sun, the smell of the sun on all of this. It was magnificent.
Teaching was a popular career. Many young women taught in the rural schools for several years before they married. A certificate for teaching could be obtained by passing a state test. Some teachers had an 8th grade education, while others had a high school diploma. Some women continued to teach after they were married because they needed the income.
Well, I lived in a little one-room shack in the yard of a Mr. and Mrs. Kerrigan. It was about a quarter of a mile from the schoolhouse. In those days, you were your own janitor. The heat for the school building was coal. We had to carry our own water from the creek. The snow on Morapas gets 5 feet deep on a level in the winter, and you have to walk to school. I had 14 children in all 8 grades, and I never had a better time in my whole life. We just had a wonderful time. I loved the kids, and they loved me, and we played games when it was so bad we couldn't get outdoors. We had jack tournaments, we had marble tournaments, we played Pussy Wants Corner. We did everything we could think of. Those children walked as far as 2.5 miles to school, and some of them didn't have overshoes, and they wrapped their feet in gunny sacks to get there, and I was really proud of them because they walked so far and worked so hard.
Deward was my housekeeper while I taught school, and everybody began to kind of get a kick out of it because he'd come down from up there. We had 2 horses, our saddle horses, and he'd ride one and lead the other down to water them every day at the creek by the schoolhouse. Then I'd get a chance to ride home from school in the evening, but he'd always come with a dish rag in his hind pocket. That dish rag was a multi-purpose piece of equipment. He dusted with it, washed dishes with it.
Well, the county superintendent is really over all the schools in the county, but the county superintendent principally looks after the rural schools, and that's what I did. And visited them, sent materials out to them, had called them into meetings, and We did a lot of things for the rural children that had never been done before, like getting them in a bus and taking them out to some meetings in Denver, spelling contests and things like that. They had a statewide club that they had a yearly meeting, and we used to take our delegates and a whole group out in the school bus, the Craig school bus, and they had a marvelous time. We went to the Capitol, and we went up in the DNF Tower, and we went to the museum, and we went every place. And then, of course, I went out and visited all the schools, you know. And I always, when I went into a school, I wanted to bring some kind of uplift for them. And so, of course, I looked for the thing that was the best, the thing that I really liked, and complimented them on it. Just think of a teacher out there, all alone, teaching the children, doing the best she could. And when the county superintendent came, if she found something wrong, it'd break her heart, wouldn't it? Yes, it would. So my chief ambition was to find what was good, suggest what was good, and give them a lift.
Without modern medicine, women were usually the caretakers of the sick and injured. Even if doctors were available, they were seldom able to offer assistance. Knowledge of home remedies was essential for a wife and mother.
I can tell you what my dad did when we had the flu, what he gave us. Sagebrush and Oregon grape root tea. And I tell you, you got well because you got to keep from taking this stuff. Oh, mercy. That was 1918 when all of us had the flu. Castor oil, my grandmother was strong on that for various things, and also sulfur and molasses. What good sulfur and molasses ever did us, I have no idea, but she used to poke it down us. And if we got a bad cold, which we did, why, we were well greased with some kind of oil and turpentine and kerosene or something, you know, that had a real bad smell. They greased us with that. And mustard plasters, oh boy.
I was surprised that Alan Hurd, he was an old fellow who lived by himself. And you know, he got tick fever. And oh, he was very bad in those days. It was awful. And he was alone. And he told me himself that he didn't know what to do. He couldn't come out of it. And he crawled out and picked sagebrush in his yard and took it in the house and boiled it. And he drank sagebrush tea, and he come out of it.
Us kids, every time we got the croup, we always got a tablespoon, a teaspoon must have been, a tablespoon would kill you, I think. And I can taste that stuff yet. A teaspoon of coal oil. Coal oil is what you put in the lamp to burn. And a teaspoon of that, and sometimes a little sugar on it, and I can still taste that and still feel it going down. But you woke up the next morning without any croup.
Groups of women provided community services, educational opportunities, as well as entertainment. The libraries in several communities were developed by women.
I think it was rather amazing that one of the first clubs to which my mother belonged in Meeker was a reading club. And of all things, they decided to read Shakespeare. My father bought my mother a set of Shakespeare, small leather-bound copies, which she treasured very greatly. And in looking through those, I find that she put down the dates of some of the plays that she was in attendance when they were read. Sometimes she jotted down the part that she read because they read them aloud. Sometimes she jotted down quotations that they discussed afterwards. And I find that they were reading Shakespeare from 1910 through 1915.
As far as clubs, after we had over 200 people in Rangeley,
before that, why, Mrs. Purdy used to have a little literary club that met, maybe once a week, or sometimes if the weather was good, and in the wintertime, maybe once a month or something like this, and they discussed what was going on in the world and literature, if people were interested in this thing. Mrs. Purdy had a library of about 200 books, of books that she'd collected over her lifetime, and occasionally somebody would get a new book and give it to her, and this was the library that Rangeley had up until the time the college came.
However busy their lives, many of these women made time for creative activities. Starting in the late 1800s, Mary Haughey, her grandmother, mother, and mother-in-law made countless quilts.
This is a crazy quilt that is all wool. Every piece in it is a type of wool, and it has been feather stitched or some type of embroidery around each block. The very center piece, white, where the red is, that white piece was a part of a funeral shroud of a cousin of mine who died from getting burned in a fireplace. This quilt was made by my aunts and my grandmother, MacDonald. This is a quilt is another unusual one that is old-fashioned calico. My grandmother Gates pieced the quilt and set it together with the pink and the blue. I collected it after years and put it together and hand quilted it. I believe the name of these blocks is the pinwheel. As you can see, it is old calico also. The blocks were pieced by my grandmother, MacDonald, and the plain gray blocks and border was of her dress that was given to me after she died.
Emma Neal used pencil and pastel to record scenes of the Meeker area. Hilda Rawlinson transformed her memories of life on Price Creek into paintings. Jennie Spence expressed many of her childhood memories in painting and poetry.
This is a poem I wrote about the last visit of the Ute Indians to Meeker, Colorado in 1903. The title of the poem is The Last Roundup. It was 1903, the year the Utes came, not as warriors on pinto ponies with feathers, beads, bows, and arrows, but they came with their belongings to the White River Valley, their winter hunting ground. Here they would get the prime buck and the barren doe. The deer was their very lifeblood. They were hungry, they were cold, their supply was low. What did they know? Here each year was plenty of food, hides for teepees, and clothes. What did they know? They would be fed, snug and warm, before the deep winter snow. That they did know. But then came the game warden, rounding them up, bringing them into Meeker. For what? They knew nothing of law and order. They knew nothing of arrest and jail. They knew nothing of white man's words or ways. The warden knew nothing of their plight. He was doing his job, enforcing the law. He would teach them to kill deer out of season, he said. Arrest them, he did. But the one-cell jail was too small. They were greasy, dirty, smelly, and unkept. The Meeker Hotel, not a chance. So they were rounded up. They were corralled in the town park, there to pitch their tents, there to wait their trial, there to try and communicate and understand. What did they know? What had they done? Wildlife had been their way from sun to sun. The warden placed guards around their camp. The townspeople looked on and felt they should be made to pay. But how? The children looked on, curious and frightened. I was one of the children, peeking through the picket fence.
I expected to be grabbed up any minute. After many powwows and smoking the peace pipe, they were rounded up, herded out of town like cattle, where, anywhere, back to the bleak reservation in Utah with little compassion, away from our own cultured civilization. Now, 1979, we are beginning to think of them as human beings with human rights, truly the first Americans. A true story. I remember it well, 1903 to 1979.
Ethelyn Crawford wrote poetry about her life in northwestern Colorado, an art she learned from her mother, Inez Whalen. When I was young and the winter hours stretched like the icicles from the eaves, my mother would say, "Let's pick word flowers." Then she'd give just one, perhaps like leaves. Then each of us, eager in his turn, would say, "Green and tall, alive or wings." With laughing lips our heart would learn the word-edged warmth of imaginings. We painted a hill with words we knew, sun-drenched and rocky, cedars and sage. Such simple ones, maybe fire or dew, released our souls from the winter's cage to a world of worth and cadency. Now, when the ground is covered white, I pick word flowers from my memory with children of mine, like love and light. Women's daily lives were difficult and challenging in northwestern Colorado in the early part of the 20th century. Their contributions to family and community are great. They offer a valuable legacy to their daughters, granddaughters, and future generations of women.